So to get a sense of the textual evidence that lies behind the Old Testament, I thought we'd start with a watershed event in biblical translation, and that's the creation of the King James Bible. This guy, James I of England. We just celebrated a number of years ago the 400th anniversary of the King James Bible. And so it's worth, because that's such a big event in the English Bible, to think about what manuscripts did they, 400 years ago, have at their disposal. When the King James Bible translators did their work, they didn't have actually an awful lot. They worked from mainly from two works, one called the Complutensian Polyglot and another called the Antwerp Polyglot. These were printed editions of biblical texts that included the Hebrew text, the Greek texts, the Vulgate in Latin, and so on, and they were used for basis of comparison. And they were produced about the 16th century, the early 1500s, and they were based on compilations of other manuscripts that the authors of those works worked with and then edited down to the kind of thing you see in columns on the screen there. In addition to that, they had about half a dozen other manuscripts. England was an island nation. It was the day before interlibrary loan and the internet, right? And so you had to make do with what was at your disposal. And for the translators of the King James Bible, that was about half a dozen late medieval Hebrew manuscripts. Now, by contrast, today, we have about 800 full manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible. So we have an awful lot more available to us today. Well, how is it that these folks that worked on this remarkable translation of the Bible had such a paucity of material? From the earliest days of the Christian church, there had been centers of ecclesial authority and Christian learning. And those were centered in the Middle East for the most part. After the time of Emperor Constantine, when Christianity became tolerated and eventually became the official religion of the empire, these places really began to flourish at more points throughout the Roman Empire. These were places where theology was taught and where biblical texts were copied and translated and then distributed to other places in the Christian world. And this map here shows you some of the big centers of Christian learning in the very earliest centuries of the church. So Alexandria in Egypt was this multi-ethnic port city. It was a global center of learning with the library, famous library there. Jerusalem, where the church began, was another center of Christian learning, and Caesarea as well became a center of Christian learning as well. And so beyond this, Antioch and other places in the empire came to be included. Now, all of this began to change in the mid-7th century AD with the rise of Islam in the Middle East. And so in the 7th century, the Arab armies bearing Islam they conquered the Arabian Peninsula, but then moved beyond it to conquer most of the Middle East and eventually beyond. Whoops. Let's go back there. There we go. And what resulted from this is that Christianity really was diminished in the areas where it had been once dominant and where its centers of learning had been established. And the Christian learning and manuscripts tended to be, as you saw the expansion up here to the north and the west, pushed towards Asia Minor, which was this area of the Byzantine Empire. And so it was the texts that remained there that came to dominate that eventually found their way to Europe. And so those texts that came to Europe were the ones that came to be multiplied and copied and copied and copied. And so the result of this situation is the situation we see today, where many, many copies exist of this type of manuscript that was common in this part of the world, but because these centers of learning were eliminated fairly early, the kinds of manuscripts that had existed there did not continue to be copied in the same way. So there are far fewer of those manuscripts in evidence today. What that means for Bible translation is you can't just count up the number of manuscripts. There's a quality to manuscripts, so you can have a manuscript family where there are very few examples of it, but and another manuscript family that has many more examples. The one that's more numerous doesn't necessarily mean it's a better text. It's kind of like comparing. Well, I had a Hyundai Pony once, and I can admit that it was a car. And there were a lot more Hyundai Ponies than, say, Rolls-Royce Silver Spurs, for example. But if you wanted to judge which was the more valuable vehicle, you just don't count the number of ponies on the road and say that's the better car, right? And it's the same thing with biblical manuscripts. You have to take in the quality of the manuscript into account. And so more does not necessarily mean better. Well, how has the situation changed since that time of the King James Version? And so for centuries following the Crusades in the medieval period, Europeans were cut off from the Middle East. You just didn't go to the Middle East as a European. But this all changed in the 19th century. So in the 1800s, the Ottoman Sultan decided he needed to modernize, and he established a new policy of modernization called Tanzimat. And so Westerners were invited into the Ottoman Empire to bring technology and such. And so beginning in the 19th century, you had large numbers of Western diplomats, business people, missionaries, scholars, and explorers that filtered back into the Middle East. And over the century or two that followed, these explorers, among them archaeologists and scholars of various kinds, began to make discoveries, archaeological discoveries through excavation, but also manuscript discoveries by poking around old libraries, monasteries, and so on. And so in the time that remains, I just want to go over some of those key manuscript sort of milestones, and we'll start sort of closer to our time and work backwards so you can get a sense of how things have improved since the days of King James as far as our evidence for the biblical text. The first body of texts I want to talk about is what's called the Masoretic text or the Ben Asher manuscripts. The oldest complete manuscripts of the Old Testament belong to this body of texts produced by a family of scribes known as the Ben Asher family. And they lived and worked from about 750 AD to about 1050 AD at Tiberias on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. And their family business, so to speak, was collecting and editing and reproducing biblical manuscripts. And their family name was Ben Asher. Their nickname was the Masoretes. And one of the things they first had to do was establish the consonantal text of the Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible is written just in consonants, Hebrew language. If you go to Israel today, pick up a newspaper, you'll find a newspaper that is full of consonants but no vowels. And that is because the vowels just typically aren't represented. You have to have vowels to pronounce words, of course, but if it's a living language, you don't need to include the vowels. In the same way, when you send a text message, you often omit vowels, and the recipient still knows what's going on because it's a living language, that text message form of English. And the same was true for ancient Hebrew. But when Hebrew died out as a living spoken language by everyone, which was the case by the time the Masoretes started their work, they had a job to do. They had to figure out what was that tradition of vowels that went along with these consonants. And so in addition to establishing what was the most authentic and original consonantal text of the Old Testament, they also set about creating a system of vowels that could be graphically represented in a text. So the larger letters here are the consonants that had always been around, but the Masoretes, their innovation was to add these dots and dashes above and below that text that represented vowels. So everyone knew exactly what they were pronouncing. So something, a word that was the equivalent of BRD, they were supplying the vowel tradition for it and representing that, so you knew it was bread and not brad, board, bird, or something else entirely, depending on what you did with the vowels. And so they had this remarkable contribution, and they produced a number of vitally important manuscripts. And this is probably the most important manuscript that they produced. Now it's called Codex Leningradensis, because for years it's been housed in what was, during the time of the Soviet Union, the city of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. And so sometimes it's referred to as the St. Petersburg Codex, but mainly Codex Leningradensis. And this represented some of the best work that the Masoretes did. Comes from 1008 AD, so it's over 1,000 years old. And today, this is the manuscript that lies at the base of pretty much every modern translation of the Old Testament. This is used as a base text. But that's still 1,000 years after Jesus, right? So let's jump back a bit earlier to see what other textual evidence that we can see. We jump back to the time of the Septuagint. The abbreviation is the Roman numeral LXX for the number 70. And in 1844, a Greek translation of the Old and New Testaments was discovered at St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai, just in the middle of nowhere. And there was this fellow, Tischendorf, who was a textual scholar, who arrived there, poked around, and found this ancient manuscript in this monastery. And he retrieved it and took it back to Britain. Now, this text was dated. It was written in Greek, but it's a translation of the Old Testament into Greek, but it dates from about 330 to 350 AD. So we're about 700 years earlier than the Masoretic text that preceded it. And over time, other similar manuscripts from this same family, and when we say Septuagint, we're not talking about one specific manuscript, but a whole series, a family of manuscripts that have the same characteristics, and in this case they're all in Greek. But there were others discovered. Codex Vaticanus, so named because it's in the Vatican Library in Rome. Codex Alexandrinus, presumably originated in Alexandria in Egypt. And these other two manuscripts dated from the 300s or 400s AD. Today, the earliest surviving text of the Septuagint is Papyrus Greek 458, also known as the John Rylands Library Papyrus. And it dates to about 250, about the 2nd century BC, so about 150 BC. That's Alexandrinus, Alexandria, and this is the John Rylands Papyrus. It's fragmentary, it's very small, but it does represent testimony to the existence of the biblical text from 150 BC, and by which time it had been translated from Hebrew into another language. And so translation doesn't occur typically in the ancient world immediately. It happens over time as a book becomes more popular and widespread. And so you presume that there is a Hebrew textual tradition that precedes this and is even earlier. In it's worth just quickly pausing at this point I've been talking about a codex, Codex Alexandrinus and so on, and we're familiar with scrolls. A scroll is simply a text that typically in Hebrew that is on two spindles, and you unroll it. That can make it difficult to find, one place, because you're rolling. A codex is much more like our modern book. And so you're just flipping leaves that are sewn together, and that makes it an awful lot easier to locate passages, to study passages as well. Well, the next element we come to is the Nash Papyrus. It's around 100 BC, and it's in Hebrew, very small, just a few inches by a few inches, and it for many years was the oldest extant portion of the Hebrew Bible that we had. Strictly speaking, it's not a biblical manuscript. It includes the Ten Commandments and the Shema from Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. And as I said, it dates from about 100 BC. But again, one of the things you can conclude from this, that this is a liturgical text. This is a text that includes portions of what we find in Scripture that were presumably for a ritual setting, right? And again, you don't produce this kind of liturgical text for something that's novel, that's something that's flippant. This is something you do with something that has some tradition, such that you're taking a portion of it and separating out into something separate. We'll see another example of that in just a minute. I wanted to move on to the big discovery that took place in the late 1940s, and that's the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the Qumran scrolls. These scrolls were discovered in 1947, and overnight, this is the remarkable thing, overnight they pushed back the evidence for the text of the Old Testament by 1,000 years, right? So scholars had gone along thinking, okay, Masoretic text, yes, it's a fine manuscript. They're from about 1000 AD, but that's still 1,000 years after Jesus and even longer after the time of the Old Testament. How do we really know that these texts represent the kind of Bible Jesus might have read? And so the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls just rolled back that timeline by a full millennia. And it's hard for us to think about it now, but if you went back to the late 40s and saw the newspaper headlines, this was a global sensation. Discovered by Bedouin on the western shore of the Dead Sea at a place called Khirbet Qumran, and they were part of a library from a community there. And so there were 800 biblical and other manuscripts, but the vast majority of them are biblical manuscripts that were represented in that library. A lot of them crushed because they were stored in jars and caves. In some caves, the roofs collapsed and smashed them, and so the texts are fragmentary, but in many cases, scholars over the decades have put them back together again and been able to read them. One book in particularly was hugely important, and that is the great Isaiah scroll that you can see in Jerusalem at the Shrine of the Book today. And it contained almost the entire edition of the book of Isaiah. And when scholars were able to compare the Masoretic text with this scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were astounded at the degree of similarity that existed across this span of two texts separated by 1,000 years. So that's one of the things that the Dead Sea Scrolls have demonstrated, is that the Masoretes did a tremendous job at tracking down that tradition, that the tradition in the 1,000 years previously was authentically preserved. But it also did something else, because there was another version of Isaiah found at Qumran that was slightly different, that was more like that Greek translation, the Septuagint. And what it showed was that in the time of Jesus, you could go, just like we can go to a Bible bookstore and buy a copy of the NIV or the New Revised Standard Version, so too in the first century, there were different versions of this material, but each version was authentically preserved over time. The last text I'll talk about is the Ketef Hinnom amulets. These were discovered in around 1980 in a tomb complex just in front of this church across the valley from my school in Jerusalem. The discoverer was Gabi Barkai, and there were a series of tombs that he excavated. And in that period, the roof of this tomb has been cut away. These people are lying on benches where the dead would have been laid out for a year while their bones decomposed. So think of like a convertible with the top down, right? That's what you're kind of looking at. You're looking into a convertible with the top down. And burial goods were put in, and the bones, after the body decomposed, the bones and the burial goods were tossed into a repository, which was a sort of a hollowed out area underneath one of the benches. And this is one of the things that was discovered. It's two little silver scrolls from the late 7th or early 6th centuries BC. So the 500s, late 500s or the early 600s BC. This is a time when there is a Judean king still on the throne, and there's still a kingdom of Judah. There's still a temple going on, and that's when these scrolls would have been made. And they're significant because, again, they preserve a passage from Numbers chapter 6, the high priestly blessing. May Yahweh bless you and keep you. May Yahweh make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. And again, this is something that it's just a tiny portion of Scripture, but it was inscribed on silver to be worn around the neck. That's not the kind of thing you do with "don't worry, be happy," or "where's the beef," or whatever kind of pop slogan comes along in any particular decade, right? This is more the kind of thing your grandmother puts a needlepoint and hangs on the wall for decades. And so even though this is a tiny portion of Scripture, it matches what we have in the Bibles we read today, and it testifies to something even earlier, because by the time this was inscribed in silver, this was already something that was of value to people, and that they cherished such that they inscribed it on a precious metal and wore it right against their heart. Well, I'm out of time, so I'll toss it back to you.